Facebook.
Oh,
Pick an avatar.
Well,
All
right, guys. It's great to see everybody.
okay, I will mute
I'm
myself.
muting everybody.
Okay, you mute me better.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to have everyone with us. And tonight we are learning our very special weekly class of the Zera Shimshon. I want to thank tonight's sponsors. As always, we really appreciate it. I kind of sound a little old, but tonight's class is going to be fantastic. I did a lot of background, historical, biblical research on a certain topic that I think many of us will find quite interesting. So thank you for all of our sponsors. In no specific order, number one, Ron and Eileen Friedman for 2 occasions. Number one, in memory of their nephew, Scott Feller, Shlomo Moshe ben Avraham and Shoshana, which June 8th was his second year anniversary, very meaningful, and a big thank you to Ron and Eileen in memory of their nephew. And also, on better news, and hopefully only good news from here on in, Mazel Tov on their 36th wedding anniversary. Double chai, so till 120 in very, very good health, happiness, and prosperity. Second, we have Mr. Joshua Grably in memory of his mother, Simcha Bat Yael. May her neshama have an aliyah. Amen. Bracha Steinfeld, in honor of all of the classes participants and specifically for her children and her grandchildren. Long, healthy, happy life. Amen. Thank you. Last but not least, we have Gabriel and Noah Rikon in honor of Gabriel's own birthday, as well as their son's birthday, Eitan ben Noah. Bezrat Hashem, may they live till 120 in good health and happiness. Amen. That's all for tonight's sponsors. Thank you, everyone. I wanted to just remind everyone, just in case you don't stay till the end of the class, tomorrow night we have another very, very special class. It's going to be with myself and Mr. Chaim Hirsch, one of my best friends. We're going to continue the Shabbat table. Last week we did the first half of the Shabbat table, and tomorrow night we're going to do the second half of the Shabbat table. If you thought last week was amazing, which it was, well, tomorrow night's going to be even more amazing. So 8:30 right here, same link. You'll get it again. And we hope that everyone can take advantage and really enjoy from this presentation. So this week we are studying the third Torah portion in the fourth book of Moses. The fourth book of Moses being the book of Bamidbar, which, as we've explained, loosely translated, we call it Numbers, but really it's called In the Wilderness. But in this book already, the nation, the Jewish nation, is already on a shift. They're now accepted the Torah. They've sinned with the golden calf. They've built their tabernacle. They're in the role of their service, and they are now forming into a nation during their traveling in the wilderness and all of the occurrences that take place there. So in this week, we are learning the third Torah portion. It's called Beha'alotecha. Now, we're not going to get into the beginning of this week's parsha. It is a long parsha. Last week was the longest parsha in the whole Torah. This week is not as long, but it is also long. There's full of amazing concepts, episodes, morals, ethics to be drawn from. And we're going to draw some from the Zera Shimshon. The Jewish people are known for, and if every Jew got $1 for every time they did the following, they'd be even wealthier. So listen to this. Jews are great at complaining. Unfortunately, and they're so good at it, there's even a special word for it that even us Sephardic Jews use. And if I would unmute everybody at the same time, you'd all say the same word, and it's kvetch. Kvetch, everyone knows what a kvetch is. Everybody kvetches. It's so Jewish. All Jews use the word kvetch. And guess where we get it from? It's not our faults. It's part of our DNA. And that is because the Jewish people, right after they received the Torah, and continuing, unfortunately, they became professional kvetchers, if I may. Now, it's a little bit funny. I'm trying to make a joke out of it. But on a serious note, we have to understand that whenever we speak about any biblical character, including the entire nation, including the entire Jewish nation, and we're kind of like making light of or making fun that that they were complaining, or whenever we speak of Moses or Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, or any of them, and we speak of a fault that they have done, it's obviously at their great and high level, and we have no right to ever, God forbid, look down at them or say, how could they have failed? Rather, the lessons in their lives when they were held on those great pedestals are just for us to really learn lessons from, and not to judge them or look down at them. On the contrary, understand they were human beings, they had their struggles, and from their stumbling, from their triumphs and their successes, we have an opportunity to learn a moral lesson to apply to our lives. I just want to use that as a disclaimer, even though we're going to speak about a little bit of the complaining that the Jewish people complained for. We're going to focus on, and this is not new news, we still do this nowadays, the Jews complaining over the food they were being served. Now, I have to be honest, this is more of an issue in the Ashkenaz households, because in a Sephardic household, the children never complain what their mommy or their grandmothers are making. Just as a disclaimer. But, and I'm happy everyone's on mute so I don't get bombarded by anybody. But, having said that, the Jews started with their first complaints, among them being, this was back in the book of Exodus, why they were taken out to die. Isn't there enough graves in the land of Egypt that they had to die? This was before the splitting of the sea. And why are we going to be put to death? And so on and so forth. They were complaining they didn't have enough water. But this week we see a new complaint. And this complaint was they were not happy with the food that they were being served by the Lord Almighty. And we're going to soon see some specifics. They wanted meat, they wanted fish, they wanted watermelon, they want all these types of fruits and vegetables, garlics and onions and zucchini and cucumber, all of these amazing, they wanted like a vegetable salad, a fruit salad, they wanted all of these things, and they were complaining because they did not have it. And as we're soon going to see, all they were eating was the man, this wonder bread, this very, very special bread that God gave the Jewish people. So, having said that the first food that the Jews complained for was meat, I thought to myself, wouldn't everyone benefit from a biblical, historical background of the permissibility of eating meat? And more of a timeline, because there were times that humanity were allowed to eat meat and not allowed to eat meat. A lot of what I'm going to say may be novel to most of us. And after doing this research, I think it's very interesting to note the allowance of eating meat, if it is, when it was, as well as making it practical today with the Zera Shimshon's great insight on why they were complaining for meat and what that means to us. So before we get into the Zera Shimshon, please allow me to give you this introduction. Instead of me just looking at my notes and just reading them to you on this specific timeline, I'm going to share the screen with you. And anyone who would like these notes in the future, after the class, whatever, please feel free to ask me for them, and it would be my honor and pleasure to share them with you. I'm taking us back. Some things here may be a little obvious, but there's a lot over here that you may have overlooked, especially timeline-wise. So we're going to go back to the Exodus. And Exodus took place on the 15th of Nisan in the year 2448. We know that, okay? 7 days later, on the 21st of Nisan, was the very famous splitting of the sea, and they were saved from the Egyptians chasing them. Now, 50 days after the Exodus is the day that the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, and they had the very famous Sinai revelation, and the 10 commandments were given to the Jewish people orally, first 2 by God, and then the subsequent 8 by Moses. Okay, next day, the 7th of Sivan, is when Moses is summoned by God, and he ascends to Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay? 40 days later, the Jews miscalculate, and we spoke about that during Shavuot time, but they miscalculated by half a day of when Moses' arrival should have been. They erred. The following morning, they sin. This is on the 17th of Tammuz. They sin with the sin of the golden calf. Moses comes down, and he breaks the first tablets. Very next day, this is the 18th of Tammuz, Moses destroys the golden calf, and he ascends up to Mount Sinai to plead on behalf of the Jewish people for another 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so just keep track. This is the second time that Moses is going up for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai. The first time's intention was to receive the tablets, to come down and give them to the Jewish people. That did not happen, so he had to go up for another 40 days, 40 nights, only to negotiate, to pray on behalf of the Jewish people to receive forgiveness for the creating and the serving of the golden calf. He comes down the 29th of Av, as you see on your screen. He tells the Jewish people they were forgiven. The next day, the 1st of Elul, Rosh Chodesh Elul, 1 month before Rosh Hashanah, Moses is told by God to come up for a third set, the third and final set of 40 days. And then 40 days later, on the 10th of Tishrei of the year 2449, which is a very famous day to us all, that's Yom Kippur itself, Moses is informed by God that he has forgiven the Jews and he should go down with the second tablets. And Moses comes down with the second tablets, presents them to the Jewish people, along with the entire oral Torah. So Moses, if we make a calculation, he goes up 3 times, 40 days and 40 nights each. That's a total of 120 days, which is corresponding to the 120 years of his life. The very following day, I think it's nice to know this timeline. This is like the prelude to the 40 years that they're going to be traveling in the desert. The very next day after Yom Kippur, the 11th of Tishrei, God commands Moses to build a tabernacle. And what was its purpose? Its purpose was in order to serve as an atonement for the sin of the golden calf the Jewish people committed. Then within 2 days, all necessary funds were collected, which is a one of. There's never been an organization that was able to raise as much funds so quickly. The 25th of Kislev, so from that day and on, from the 14th, let's say, was when they started the building of the tabernacle, and the construction of the tabernacle was completed 74 days after its being commanded to the Jewish people. Next, there's a hold. The Jewish people wait. We've spoken about that previously in Parashat Pikudei, why there was a wait from the 25th of Kislev till the 23rd of Adar. But that's the first week of the inauguration of the tabernacle, the 23rd to the 29th of Adar. The beginning of the month of Nisan, its first 12 days, was the official dedication of the tabernacle with all the tribal leaders and bringing their sacrifices. We learned that in last week's Torah portion. Okay? This week, we read about what happens. Okay, then the 14th of Nisan was the second the first official observing of the Passover holiday. They slaughtered on the 14th. They observed it from the 15th to the 21st. Now, this week, we learn about Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. And that was for anyone who missed the opportunity to bring their Pesach sacrifice. They had an opportunity on the 14th of Iyar, exactly 1 month after the 14th of Nisan, as you see, okay, to slaughter the Passover, and that was for any sacrifice. That was for anyone who missed it or was impure and wasn't able to do it. Now look at where we are now. This happens in this week's Torah portion. The 20th of Iyar is the day that the Jewish people set out and they start traveling from Mount Sinai. The pillar of the cloud rose, and they started traveling from Mount Sinai. I just wanted to put into perspective, from the day the Jewish people came to Mount Sinai till the day they left was a full year shy 2 weeks. So they were encamped in the same place for almost a whole year. Mind you, it was at Mount Sinai, but there was a lot going on over there. There was a lot of good, there was some bad, and then there was some atonement at the same time. But on the 20th of Iyar is when they officially started traveling. Now this is where it gets interesting. 3 days later, on the 23rd of Iyar, was when the Jewish people started complaining. Can you imagine? They're standing in front of God. They're there for a full year, almost a full year in front of God. And then 3 days after they leave Mount Sinai, they start their complaining. And then we wonder why our children complain, why we complain. And this is the source. Even after being a whole year with God, unfortunately, they started complaining after 3 days. And they came to a place where the Torah calls Kivrot HaTa'ava, and that's where they were requesting meat. They waited another 7 days for Miriam when she spoke at the end of this week's Torah portion ill about Moses, as we will speak about. And then, just to lead us into next week's Torah portion, the 29th of Sivan was when the spies were sent into Israel for 40 days, which was just 40 days after leaving Mount Sinai. So we'll speak about that next week. But I thought this timeline is important because it gives us a perspective of what's going on from the day that they left Egypt until the day that they leave Mount Sinai. And then, unfortunately, 3 days later, they start complaining. So look at the verse that tells us that they are complaining. This is in Numbers chapter 11, verse 1. And it tells us as follows. Vayhi ha'am kemit'onenim ra be'oznei Adonai. And the people were looking to complain, unfortunately. And it was evil in the ears of the Lord. Vayishma Adonai vayichar apo. And the Lord heard, and his anger flared. Vativ'ar bam esh Adonai vatochal biktzei machane. And a fire from the Lord burned amongst them, consuming the extremes of the camp, meaning the people who were instigating this whole idea of trying to unfortunately rebel against God and start complaining. So, the Zera Shimshon wants to point out that the Jews that were traveling in the wilderness, the Jews that actually left Egypt, that whole generation, as we refer to as Dor De'ah, that is the generation of enlightenment, because they saw the 10 plagues, they saw the splitting of the sea, they were there at the Sinai revelation. It's something that no one else can even imagine. They were not permitted to eat meat. The Zera Shimshon proves from various sources, including the Torah itself. There was one exception to the Jews being allowed to eat meat, and that was eating meat from sacrifices. So, when the Zera Shimshon made this statement, I wanted to look back in our Torah and see, well, when was it that the Jewish people were allowed to eat, or humanity was even allowed to eat meat? So, I went back all the way to the book of Genesis. And Adam was given 7 laws. They're called, as we know them, as the 7 Noahide laws. But he was also given another 2 laws. So I'll briefly remind us about the 7 Noahide laws. The first is that we're not allowed to profane God's oneness in any way. We're not allowed to mention his name in vain. Number 2, we're not allowed to curse God. Number 3, we're not allowed to murder anybody. Number 4 was a commandment on sexual morality. Number 5 is we're not allowed to steal. Number 6 is we need to establish courts of law, ensuring that there's justice in the world. And number 7 is we're not allowed to eat from a limb of an animal. But just to clarify, the first one again was that we're not allowed to commit any idolatry. Can't worship any other gods, okay? And the last one we just mentioned was we're not allowed to eat a limb from a living animal. This is the famous 7 Noahide laws. Adam was given another 2 laws. One was that he's not allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge, as we know, and that's where his great mistake was. But he also had a prohibition of eating meat. He was not allowed to eat any living animal, and that means he could not kill any animals, poultry, fish. Adam had a completely vegetarian, I guess you could even call it a vegan. He had a complete vegan lifestyle. And that was his 9 commandments. Those are the 2 extra ones for him. Those actually continued on. And the question that we have to ask, I saw this in the Beha'alotecha, is if Adam was commanded as part of the 7 Noahide laws that he cannot eat a limb from an animal, from a living animal, right? So why does God have to come and tell him, you can't eat any meat? If he's not allowed to eat meat, so then he's not allowed to eat a limb from a living animal, right? You're not allowed to eat meat from a living animal, so why does God tell him you can't eat any meat at all? So the Beha'alotecha answers something, and this is a very important novelty, and this really gives us what the law was for Adam and his descendants, is that Adam was not allowed to slaughter any living being for consumption. He was allowed, however, to eat a dead animal that he found. Now, granted, he would have to find it quite quick so another animal doesn't eat it or doesn't get rotten. But if Adam found a dead animal, he would be, if he wanted to, allowed to go and eat it. So therefore, explains the Imam Loez, that since Adam was not allowed to slaughter an animal, but he was allowed to eat a dead animal that he found, God had to come and reiterate, you cannot not kill an animal to eat from it. Meaning, you can't just chop off a leg of an animal and eat it and say, not a problem because the animal's still alive. No, there's two prohibitions. You cannot chop up a leg from a living animal and eat it, and you cannot kill an animal and eat it. You could only eat a dead animal that was found. So this comes out, and this is very interesting, that the first 10 generations of humanity, and I'll explain you why 10, and that is from Adam until Noah, the Jewish people, not the Jewish people, mankind was not allowed to eat any meat from any animal unless it was found dead. But then something changed in the year 1657. Now, 1657 from the Jewish years, okay? This is when Noah emerges from the ark. Noah comes out, and he was frightened at the sight of the world that he found. It was a destroyed world. It was a place where he used to live with his extended family and friends and humanity, even though humanity degenerated to a horrible place. And the Midrash says that him and his children came out and they started crying. And they looked at this destroyed world. And they were at a loss. All the people they knew were gone. All the places they built and they've seen were all gone. And they were scared what would be with their very own fate. At that point, listen closely, God makes 5 promises to Noah right when he comes out. He comes out and he says, number 1, he promises there's never going to be a global flood again. And the sign, as we all know, was the very famous rainbow. Number 2, God promises Noah that him and his children will repopulate this empty world, that mankind will not perish. And he commanded him, Pru'uvu, go be fruitful and multiply. Number 3, animals will not kill him. You see, Noah and his family, they were a minority compared to the animal kingdom, right? He saved 2 from each animal. So he thought that maybe the animals are going to kill him. God promised him that the animals will be at peace with Noah even after they leave the ark, and they will not kill him. Furthermore, number 4 is that God is going to demand an accounting for any animal or any human being who kills another. That God will make sure himself that the murderer will be punished and even killed through divine means. Now, to our topic, number 5 was God gave Noah the first time ever the permission to slaughter fresh meat, poultry and fish, and consume it. Before then, it was not permitted. When Noah was 601 years old, in the year 1657, was the first time that mankind was permitted by God to eat fresh meat. So you come and you ask yourself, well, what changed? If for the first 1600 years of the world, that's the way it was, why did God all of a sudden change on it? So for this, I saw in the Nachmanides, the Ramban, who gives a fascinating interpretation. He says that at creation, human beings and animals were at a somewhat of an equal. Animals were created before the human beings. They had a certain respect in their own right. Human beings, they had an advantage. They were created in the image of God. They were able to communicate through speech. But on a certain level, they were at equal levels and gave no right for any man or woman to slaughter an animal and eat it. However, explains Nachmanides, what happened during the flood? Noah saved the animal kingdom. All animals owe their lives, so to say, their continuity to Noah. It was Noah who saved them all in the ark. Noah who fed them, who took care of them, and Noah who let them free and let them go and repopulate the world. So that explains that Nachmanides put Noah on top of the animals, giving him right, as God permitted him, to slaughter an animal in order to consume it. So the very first time mankind could eat meat was when Noah emerges from the ark. Now, all the way from Adam until Abraham, all types of animals were eaten, not just kosher animals. Then Adam and his descendants probably only ate kosher animals because they learned, they were fed a lot of Torah by God through divine inspiration, through prophecy. So they probably ate only kosher animals. But it's until the time of Mount Sinai, that is when all the laws of kashrut were given, all the kosher animals and the non-kosher animals, and the way to properly slaughter the animals. And that's, by the way, why on Shavuot we have a tradition to eat dairy, is because the Jews themselves were overwhelmed. They were told all these laws of kashrut, and they said, this is very complicated. Maybe our dishes and our pots are not all kosher. And then they went and they ate dairy, which was something a lot easier. So in truth, the Zera Shimshon tells us that this generation left Egypt, they were eating meat. But when they came to Mount Sinai, after the Sinai revelation, they were prohibited to eat meat from then and on, with one exception, the exception of eating sacrificial meat. Any sacrifice that was brought that wasn't fully burnt, they were able to eat it. And this explains the Zera Shimshon was the reason why they were complaining. So with that biblical historical background of eating meat, we'll get into how nowadays we're allowed to consume meat and how to consume meat. The Zera Shimshon is going to help us with that in a very, very beautiful way. But it's important to note that the Jews of the wilderness were not allowed to eat meat. And the question is, why not? Why would they not be allowed to eat meat? So the Zera Shimshon brings a midrash, it's the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, who says, well, first of all, I would just want to reiterate, the Zera Shimshon gives two answers, okay? I'm going to share the first and then the second, and then we're going to tie it together. The first answer to Zera Shimshon, based on the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, is that the Jewish people saw God at Mount Sinai. They heard God at Mount Sinai. That's something which is superhuman. It's not natural. And because of that, they're not allowed to eat meat. Why not? Zera Shimshon says, why not? Just because they were there? So he says, there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Mishnah 8, that says, Marbe basar, marbe rima. Simply translated, that means the more flesh, the fatter a person, the healthier a person is in size. Unfortunately, when they pass away and they're buried, the more worms and maggots, the more worms and maggots are going to feed off that person. It's just very factual. But the Zera Shimshon wants to learn it a little different. He says, you know what marbe basar, marbe rima means? The more meat a person eats, basar means meat. Not the more flesh and meat a person has, but the more meat a person eats is the more worms they're going to have, worms and maggots that they're going to have eating off them when they're buried. So, the Zera Shimshon says that this generation, the generation that left Egypt, the generation that saw God and heard God at Mount Sinai, they were at a level that they were not going to suffer from any worms or maggots when they pass away and they're buried. They were at that high level. And therefore, the Zera Shimshon explains, God did not want the Jewish people to activate the worms within them, not by eating meat. So they were told, no more meat. Oh, if that's so then how could they eat the meat of the sacrifices? Shouldn't it be no meat that they're allowed to eat? So the Zera Shimshon brings an answer from the Mikubalim, from the great mystical teachings, and he says, anything consumed, including meat, but anything consumed during a seudat mitzvah, which means a meal that is for, how do we say, a mitzvah, a good deed, as I'll give you a couple of examples, will never allow anything that a person puts on, whether it's fat or any of the sort, or flesh, will never be something that will be consumed by worms after death. For example, the food that we eat on Shabbat and on Yom Tov, right? There's the very famous saying, there's no Shabbat calories. Go and eat and splurge and enjoy yourself. There is truth to that saying. And that is because the meals that we eat on Shabbat are considered a seudat mitzvah. They're considered a meal which is of fulfilling a mitzvah. And therefore, none of that ever falls to the side that will ever be considered fat or flesh that will be consumed by worms. So the reason why the Jewish people were not allowed to eat meat was so that the worms shouldn't consume them, because they were at a very high level being at Mount Sinai. So how did they eat the sacrificial meat? Because the sacrificial meat was a seudat mitzvah. It was food which was a part of them fulfilling a mitzvah of bringing that sacrifice. That's the first answer of the Zera Shimshon. Now let's listen to the second answer. The second answer is that the Jewish people, when they came to Mount Sinai, they connected to God in a way that was never done before, in a very, very special way. They connected to him in the way that the Torah says. I'm going to share with you this verse. The verse says in Deuteronomy, everyone see? Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 4, it says, V'atem hadevekim b'Adonai Elohechem chaim kulechem hayom. But you who cleave to the Lord your God are alive, all of you this day. This is talking about from the day that they stood at Mount Sinai. They became part and parcel with God, explains the Zera Shimshon. And therefore, the Zera Shimshon says that God prohibited the Jewish people to eat meat because he didn't want them to become susceptible to the influence of the evil inclination. He didn't want the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, to take a stronghold on them. And he proves this from the following, like, what does eating meat have to do with the Yetzer Hara? The Talmud in Masechet Brachot, page 32a says, and I quote, that a lion only roars from a container of meat, which means that a lion only feels excited to eat something when it has the food in front of it, and it roars and it's getting excited and it has this urge to pounce upon it. Hashem did not want the Jewish people to lose their connection to him through indulging in meat, from indulging in mundane meat. But the Jews complained about that. They wanted meat. Let me show you. The verse says, look at this, 11:4. It says, V'hasafsuf asher bekibor hitavu ta'ava. But the multitude amongst them began to have strong cravings. Who's the multitude? That's the mixed multitude. That's the Egyptians who tagged along and they said, we want to be part of this great, great, amazing thing. But they didn't come with noble intentions. They were the ones who started the cravings. And they, vayashuvu vayivku, they sat and they started crying. Gam b'nei Israel, also the Jewish people, they were a bad influence. And what does everyone say, including the Jews? Mi, vayomeru mi yachilenu basar. Who will feed us meat? This was their very first complaint when it came to food. They wanted meat. You know why the Zera Shimshon says? They were not only looking for the meat of the korbanot, they knew that would keep them connected to God. But the mixed multitude, those Egyptians that came along, they were looking for a way for the Jewish people to stray from God. For them, they didn't want the Jews to stay close and connected to God. They knew that the prohibition of meat, says Zera Shimshon, was in order to serve as a connection between them and God. But some wanted to sever that, says the Zera Shimshon. Based on this, the Zera Shimshon explains a fascinating verse that King David writes. Look at this. King David writes in Tehillim chapter 22, verse 27. And this verse really, really begs some some explanation, and the Zera Shimshon showers beautiful light on it right away. He says, Yochelu anavim visbau. The humble shall eat and be satiated. What does being humble have to do with feeling full? When you eat something, it depends if you're humble or if you're arrogant to see if you're going to be full or not, asks the Zera Shimshon. Aha. He says that what does humility have to do with being satiated? He says the Talmud in Masechet Brachot, also on page 32a, says that the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, can only control someone who eats and drinks. He brings a proof. Take a look at your screen. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 12. What do the Jewish people say when they will deviate from God? Pen tochal v'savata. God warns us. Be careful lest you eat and be satiated. Uvatim tovim tivne v'yashavta. And you're going to go and build houses, beautiful big houses, and dwell in them. What's going to happen? 2 verses later, chapter 8, verse 14. Veram levavecha. And your heart will grow haughty. V'shachachta et Adonai Elohecha. And you're going to forget the Lord your God. Hamotziacha me'eretz mitzrayim mibeit avadim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. The Zera Shimshon proves from here, as well as from the Talmud, that when a person overindulges in food, it's very easy for the evil inclination to take hold of them and for them to forget the focus, forget the connection they have with the Almighty. King David was saying that only when a person controls themselves in how they indulge, and how can a person control themselves not to indulge, is humility. A person who feels entitlement. Everything was created for me. Everything is mine. Everything's available. Then they allow their indulging to activate the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, to take hold of them. But on the contrary, a person who is humble and they realize that indulging is going to sever the connection between them and the Almighty, they're going to not allow that to infiltrate. So I have a couple lessons based on this, and I think we can really, really make this very applicable. The first thing I want to say is that today, we are permitted to eat meat. Yes, we have to slaughter them properly, in a kosher manner. We salt them so all the blood's not there. We can't mix meat and milk. We know that. But there's a difference in when and how we eat meat. Do we eat it like animals? Right? There's something to be said about eating a burger with all 10 fingers eating it. Again, maybe that is what's become normal to us. But in our own ways, in our own levels, we all need to realize that we should eat everything, but especially meat, in a refined manner. And that is something which is absolutely important. We learn this from this idea that the Jewish people were prohibited to eat meat, yet we are allowed to. But why were they? Because they were at a very high level, and God didn't want to sever the connection. We have a different connection with God than the generation of enlightenment, the Dor De'ah. Our connection with God permits us to eat meat in a permissible manner, but not to eat it, number one, like an animal, and number two, when? Do you eat meat every day? Do you eat meat twice a day? Once a week? Once a month? Each person should gauge and make it a special occasion when they eat meat. Ideally, Shabbat and the holidays, weddings, circumcisions, bar mitzvahs. Great occasions when it's considered a seudat mitzvah, the siyum of a masechet, the finishing of a tractate of the volume of the Talmud. All of these are examples of a seudat mitzvah, a meal which is a mitzvah, which is a good deed. It's for a good and proper, godly, Torah-like celebration. Maybe only then, maybe not limited to that. Maybe we could also eat meat other times, but making sure that it is a special occasion and obviously not overindulging. Okay, how much meat? Well, it's this constant battle between indulge or humility. Or is eating meat a way to disconnect from God or to connect to God? These are all questions we need to ask ourselves. Is eating meat something which cheapens us? or is it something that elevates us? These are the questions we are to ask while we eat meat. Now, one more thing I want to say, maybe two more things that I want to say about this concept is that this concept applies also to all other physical pleasures. Whether it's junk food, whether it's relaxing, oversleeping, anything that brings a person physical pleasure, we are not only permitted but obligated to, so to say, take part of. But there's a fine line between taking part of, enjoying, and then overdoing it and indulging. And this is something that Zera Shimshon is teaching us. Make sure that anytime you partake in any physical pleasures, make sure it's a way to connect you to God, a way for you to realize God's greatness, God's oneness, that which he presented in front of you to enjoy from, to partake from. And this is a great, great difference in a person's mindset of when they are taking pleasure in anything. So when a person indulges even in permitted pleasures, they're placing themselves as a Zera Shimshon in a jeopardy of maybe falling prey to the lacking resistance of their Yetzer Hara. And therefore, we need to keep our guard up and make sure not to cross over that line. Last but not least, and this is something which all meat lovers quote, and this is that which the Talmud says in Masechet Psachim, page 109a. And that is, En simcha, there's no true joy or happiness, ela bebasar v'yayin, unless a person is attaining it through eating meat and drinking wine. That obviously means in a moderation. Eating meat, drinking wine is all permitted, but it depends when and it depends how. By the way, it's important to note that the two stolen items of the wayward rebellious child was meat and wine, and overindulging in an excess amount of meat and wine. So we're playing with fire when we eat meat and when we drink wine. But just like fire is very important, it's needed to cook, it's needed to heat up, it's needed in certain parts of construction, casting metal and all that. But fire is also dangerous. And so is meat, and so is wine. Now, moving on to the next topic, which we're going to bring the meat and the wine right into as well, is the Jewish people are complaining about their new diet. And they complain about the man. I want to share with you the verse that the Torah tells us that they start complaining. It says, Ve'ata, this is in Numbers chapter 11, verse 6. Ve'ata nafshenu yevesha in kol. But now our bodies are dried out, for there is nothing at all. Bilti elaman enenu. All we have is nothing but the manna to look at, meaning to eat. The Jewish people were complaining that all God gave them to eat was man. Now, let's just understand what this man is. Man is, as we're soon going to see, it was white. It was tasting like anything you wanted it to taste like. Whatever it is that you had in mind, you just put it in your mind and it tastes like that. An apple, a burger, ice cream, whatever it is, chocolate, whatever it is you had in mind to taste like, it tasted like it instantly. And you could change flavors from one bite to the next. It was fascinating. It was a true miracle. However, the Jewish people were complaining. And the Zera Shimshon explains that their complaint was misguided because their claim was really a big mistake. See, the Zera Shimshon quotes the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat, page 129a. We're going to get there in a couple of weeks in Daf Yomi. And it says that after bloodletting, which was something common back in the time of the Talmud, in yesteryear, it was healthy to bloodlet. Again, their diets were very different than ours. They were high in salt, high in sulfur. Even their wine was very, very, very thick and very pure, so to say, that they had to dilute it right prior to drinking it, or else a person would get so drunk and sick that it would be intolerable. The wine we drink nowadays is diluted multiple times over, okay? So the Talmud says after bloodletting, there's something healthy that you should do in order to help a person regain their strength. And that is to eat meat and to drink wine. Okay? These were beneficial, the beneficial nutritional properties that were in meat and in wine was something that would help a person recover from the fatigue of bloodletting. So listen to what the Shimshon says. You know what the Jewish people said? The Jewish people are saying, we're tired. Nafshenu yevisha. Our souls are exhausted from this traveling in the wilderness. Mind you, it's only been 3 days, right? Okay. They're exhausted from traveling. You know what they said they need? They need meat. They need wine. Meat gives strength. Wine brings the redness back to a person's face. That's what we need. This man you're giving us, God, the Jewish people are saying, doesn't have those nutritional benefits. Those benefits that will give us that strength, that meat, that protein, that muscle that we need, and that redness that will bring back that will take us back from our fatigue. You see, the man, take a look at your screen, as referred to in Numbers 21, Numbers 11, verse 21, it says, no, this is not it. 1 second. Which verse am I looking for? Give me a moment. Sorry. Deuteronomy 1:1, which I did not pull up. Okay. In the beginning of Deuteronomy, Moses is rebuking the Jewish people for everything they've done. And it's when in a hinting manner. And when he refers to them complaining about the man, he refers to it in one word, vilavan, and the white. Because the manna was white, something which is not appealing as a food, right? Think of a red, crunchy, juicy apple. It's the redness, it's the texture, it's the nutritional benefits that it has that we get excited over eating an apple. And there's the temperature, the density, whether it's soft, crunchy, all of these things add towards the enthusiasm and the inspiration for a person to want to consume a certain food. They were lacking that in the man. And they were feeling that it's missing all that, but most important, it's missing the nutritional benefits. We need our life back. We need to gain strength. By how? Eating meat and drinking wine. The Shimshon says they're making such a big mistake. And God was deliberate in making the man white. Listen to what he says. This is something that we've heard before. The Talmud in Masechet Ketubot, page 111b, says something so meaningful, so important in our interpersonal relationships. And I'll quote, it says, one who whitens his teeth, meaning someone who smiles to another, is greater. They're giving more to a person than a glass of milk, which is white, which has tremendous nutritional benefits. But smiling to a person, you give them much more. Comes as Shimshon and says that God is giving the Jewish people the white man. Why white? White like teeth, because God is smiling at them. He's telling them that there's more beneficial nutritional factors to this man than any other food, because it was given to them by God. It gives them that encouragement, that inspiration. And by the way, it has all of those nutritional benefits that meat and wine have and more, even though you don't think so. And this was the great mistake the Jews made by complaining about the man and wanting meat in its stead. I have two lessons from this piece of the Zera Shimshon. Number one is the importance of understanding non-tangible benefits that we either give or receive. A smile, a good word, is a non-tangible benefit. It's a gift you give someone which transcends many times anything physical you can do for somebody. we should never overlook the importance of greeting somebody, smiling to them, cheering them up, thanking them, giving someone a good word. And don't overlook when someone does it to you. You may be having a hard day, a hard week, a hard month, a hard life. But do not allow the non-tangible gifts people give you to just be disregarded by yourself. Pay attention to them, soak them in, and be inspired from them, feel good from them. And recognize how good that makes you feel, and make sure to reciprocate that towards others. That's the first thing I wanted to mention. The second is, in our life, we need to look for the smiles God sends us. See, the Jewish people had it right there. It was white man, white like teeth. It's a smile. It's like all over the place, every single day. But they didn't see it. So in life, we need to look for them. They may be right in front of us. We need to seek guidance and counsel. And we need to learn more Torah to locate them in our lives. But we have an obligation to. Because when we see the smiles God sends our way, we understand that God favors us as his chosen nation. He loves us and he wants us to do well and succeed and grow in our connection with him. May it be through meat, may it be through wine, may it be through Torah study, may it be through enjoying a little, may it be through abstaining. But we need to look for those smiles. We need to look for those business deals that seemed impossible to happen and they happened. Those offers, those hires, being hired, succeeding, overcoming a health complication. Anything that happens in life, we need to look for those smiles that God is sending our way and never give up on ourselves. Moving on to the next. Even though we could continue on this, I know it's getting late, and I have two more pieces of Zera Shimshon to share with us. So the Jews complained to Moses, and Moses prays to God in this week's Torah portion. And God tells Moses, they'll get their meat. Don't worry. Take a look at your screen. This is chapter 11, verse 21. Vayomer Moshe, and Moses tells the Jewish people, Shesh me'ot elef ragli ha'am asher anochi bekirbo ve'ata amarta basar etin lahem ve'achilu chodesh yamim. Moses says, you are 600,000 people, and we know that was only the men between ages 40 and 60, who are standing here, who in their midst I am, and you say that you want meat, I'll give it to you for a full month, Moses says. Because he spoke to God, and him and God agreed on, the Jewish people will have a whole month to eat meat. They'll get it out of their system, so to say. Based on this verse, the Talmud in Masechet Sotah, page 12b, says that Moses was telling the Jewish people, it's in my merit, Moses says, in my merit, that you are all so numerous and strong. Really? How so? Well, the Talmud explains. Remember the Egyptian stargazers at the beginning of the book of Exodus? They came and they told Pharaoh, the Jewish savior will be born. And we need to get rid of all of the boys, so let's throw them all in the Nile. Now, the reason why they did this, they were somewhat smart, not fully smart. They said, you know why throw them in the Nile? Because the Nile is water. God, as we mentioned earlier, promised Noah he's never going to bring a flood on the world. It's the only way that we're not going to get repercussion, measure for measure, the way God punishes for killing his children. We know they've faulted. We know they made a mistake. We know they were punished through water. When Moses explains the Talmud, when Moses was placed in the water, in the Nile River, the decree of the stargazers was nullified. Meaning they came and told Pharaoh, their savior got to the water. No more. Don't worry. We don't need to kill any more babies. Based on this, so Moses is saying that it's because of me that everyone is now live and strong. Because when I was put into the Nile River, all the babies stopped dying. Comes the Tosafot, the commentary on the Talmud, and says, 1 second. It was only because of Moses that the decree started from the beginning. Babies were being thrown into the Nile only because of Moses. Yeah, so fine. So when he was thrown in the water, the decree stopped. But how many casualties came along the way? I'll give you an example. Imagine, God forbid, someone lights a building on fire. He causes the fire. And then he either calls the fire department, or he puts out the fire and he takes pride and credit for it. Hello, mister. You're the person who started the problem. It's like if someone comes and beats the living daylights out of somebody, and then he's so nice and he takes the guy to the ER. Are you serious? So the Tosafot is wondering, how could Moses be taking pride and credit that the Jewish people are so numerous for him being thrown in the Nile River when the whole decree was because of him in the first place? Tosfot answers, in truth, and this is a novelty, this is something that may be new to many of us, Moses was the very first baby thrown in the Nile River. There weren't any other babies that thrown in the Nile River. Other babies were being murdered, but not because of the decree of Moses. They were being murdered before Moses was even born because that was a war tactic. Their war tactic was, well, we have another nation living in our midst, and therefore we don't want their boys to become too numerous and too strong, so we're going to start killing off their boys. This happened to Shifra and Pua, which is really Miriam and Yocheved and Miriam. They were approached by Paro, and Paro told them, kill all the boys. This was before Moses was even born. And therefore, the Tosafot says that the Egyptians never threw any babies because of Moses' decree into the water. Moses was the very first one put in. So he was able to take credit for no baby dying. So the Zera Shimshon has a question. He says, so why is Moses taking any credit? Why is he taking any pride in the fact that he saved them from the decree if the decree stopped right away? Like it was for a hot minute, there was a decree, and now there's no more. Explains the Zera Shimshon, you know what Moses was really trying to say to the Jewish people? He was saying if it was never for the decree that the Egyptians had to throw the Jewish people in the Nile, the babies in the water in the Nile River, then the Egyptians would have never drowned in the sea at any time. They would have never came to Yam Suf. Why? Because the Egyptians' intention was to drown the Jews, so they were punished that they were drowned. If it wasn't for Moses' decree, the decree against Moses, that would have never happened. So Moses, because of Moses, the Egyptians really drowned in the Sea of Reeds. The Egyptians would have never drowned if it wasn't for Moses, and the Jews would have never really been free. The Egyptians would have came back on and on and on, trying to recapture them as their slaves. The Zera Shimshon brings a proof. There's a contradiction between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. How much of the Hallel, the praise that we sing to God, do we need to finish before reciting the blessing on the Passover Seder of Ga'al Yisrael, the blessing where we praise God for redeeming the Jewish people? And we go with Bet Hillel. Bet Hillel says we need to finish the entire 2 first paragraphs of the Hallel. Why? Because at the end of the 2nd paragraph mentions the splitting of the sea. Take a look at your screen. It says over here, Tehillim chapter 114, verse 8, Ha'ofechi hatzur agam mayim, chalamish lemaino mayim. Who transforms the rock into a pond of water, which means, explains our commentaries, that King David is saying that the ocean first turned into a bedrock of water, a bedrock, in order that the Jewish people can walk on it. And then water came and put up big walls, and then the flint into a fountain of water is the second miracle, that any Jew who was thirsty during their travel in the sea was able to reach into the walls of the water, and there'd be sweet springs of drinkable water that they were able to drink. So Bet Hillel says you need to finish both of these chapters of Tehillim, which is not the whole Hallel, but you need to read those 2 before you make the blessing of Ga'al Yisrael, because that's only when the Jewish people were really saved, by the splitting of the sea when the Egyptians drowned. So Moses is telling the Jewish people, says the Zera Shimshon, that they were freed from Egypt only because the Egyptians drowned. And that happened only because the stargazers made a decree against Moses. And since Moses was put in the first, no one else passed away. So Moses is coming and saying, you are 600,000 men, plus. You're 3 million people today. You're standing here, and I prayed on your behalf, and God accepted. But you're here because of me. Stop giving me such a hard time. And in life, we sometimes have to realize not to be so hard on our leaders. They're in a tremendous amount of pressure, responsibility, so much on their shoulders. We can't be so stringent on them. And Moses was pleading to the Jewish people. He was saying, guys, cut me some slack. So you want some meat? Let me go see if I could do something about it. But as we know, Jewish people, time and time again, they came with their kvetching, their complaining, and they gave Moses a hard time. Moses did have a really hard time from the Jews. But what we see here is him pleading to them to cut him a little bit of slack. I'm going to end off with the last piece of the Zera Shimshon I want to share with us this evening. And this is a piece about the episode of Miriam, Moses' older sister, criticizing Moses, saying and verbalizing this to her brother Aaron, about Moses divorcing his wife Tzipporah. Take a look at your screen. Numbers chapter 12, verse 2, it says, Vayomeru harak achbe Moshe diber Adonai, halo gam banu diber vayishma Adonai. They said, has the Lord spoken only to Moses? Hasn't he spoken to us too? And the Lord heard. Meaning, in other words, Miriam is telling her brother Aaron, who does Moses think he is to divorce his wife? Is he so holy, so much more holy than the rest of us, that he's not allowed to be married? Why so? God spoke to us all at Mount Sinai. He spoke to each and every one of us, and we still need to stay married. Why does Moses think he's different? Well, just to tell us what the Talmud tells us, Masechet Shabbat, we saw this recently in Daf Yomi, that Moses made a kal vachomer. He drew out a basic conclusion. He said, if God wanted the Jewish people to separate themselves 3 days prior to Mount Sinai, the Sinai revelation, meaning husbands and wife need to stay separate. So me, Moses says, that I'm in touch with God every single day. He's talking to me, I'm talking to him. Shouldn't I be separate from my wife? And God agreed to Moses. He said, Moses, you're right. You are different. You should be separate from your wife. But Miriam and Aaron didn't see it that way. And the Zera Shimshon wants to know, well, what was God's answer to that concern? So God's answer to that concern is the very next verse. Chapter 12, verse 3, it says, Ve'aish Moshe anav me'od. Now this man, Moses, was exceedingly humble. Mikol ha'adam asher al pnei adama. More so than any person on the face of the earth. God tells Miriam and Aaron, Moses is exceedingly humble. He did the right thing. So the Zera Shimshon says, how does the fact, or how do we know that Moses is humble? From the fact that he was silent? That's normal. It's expected from a person. The Talmud of Masechet Yomah, page 23a, says that a humble person, I'll say it in Hebrew, shom'in cherpatam ve'enan mashivim. They hear their insult and they don't answer because they're humble. So Zera Shimshon wants to know what's so extraordinary about Moses being silent when his siblings are speaking negatively about him. That's something normal. That's something that all humble people have. And that this makes Moses the most humble person ever? So in order to answer this question, the Zera Shimshon answers it with a question. He says, are Aaron and Miriam really comparing themselves to their brother Moses? I mean, face it. Yeah, everyone heard God at Mount Sinai, but Moses went up. He was there for 40 days and 40 nights, not once, not twice, 3 times. And he was there, and he was direct connection with God. Very, very different. So how is it that Miriam and Aaron were on a certain way comparing themselves and the rest of the nation to Moses. So listen to what the Zera Shimshon says. He says, Miriam and Aaron really understood that Moses was greater in that aspect. He had a greater opportunity. But they didn't attribute it to Moses's own self, his own worth, so to say. Rather, they attributed it to the position that he held of being the leader, the messenger, the prophet, the king of the Jewish people. That it was because of his position that he was granted all that great access that no one else had. But if it would have been another person that would have had that position, it would have been them too. God comes and says, no, wrong. Moses is so different. He's inherently worthy of coming up to Mount Sinai, to Shamayim, to heavens, 40 days, 3 times, because of his humility, because he was the most humble person that ever walked the face of this earth. That's why he was chosen from the get-go. Make absolutely no mistake, no other prophet would have had that access and that opportunity. The Talmud in Masechet Sotah says on page 5a that the only way a person can get close to God is through humility. When we act in a humble way, we're able to connect to God. So this verse of V'ha'ish Moshe anav meod mikol adam asher al pnei adama, that Moses was exceedingly humble, more so than any other human being that ever walked the face of this earth. He's not responding to Miriam's and Aaron's. Sorry, he's not responding to the way Moses was acting of being silent. That we know. We know that a humble person is quiet. It was responding to Miriam and Aaron's mistake. Their conclusion was Moses is not super important or super special. That's why he was chosen up, and we should all be the same. Who does he think that he should separate from his wife? No. God is saying Moses is absolutely different from you. He's a different caliber. He's a different level. He divorced from his wife, and he drew the right, the proper conclusion. Because he's different, because he is so exceedingly humble. The lesson I want to bring out from this is that humility, we have to remind ourselves that humility is something which is attractive. People want to be around people who are down to earth and humble. We need to remind ourselves to always be like that. Haughtiness, arrogance, on the contrary, is repulsive. No one wants to be next to a loudmouth or in company of someone who's very pompous and got it all and knows it all. And that's not fun. That's not attractive. It's repulsive. We have to remind ourselves that greatness is synonymous with humility. Moses was great, so great, because of his humility. And the great levels of prophecy that he achieved, which is unparalleled to any other prophet that ever walked the face of this earth, was all attributed to his tremendous levels of humility. So if we want to connect to God, we can, but we have to remind ourselves to be humble, to be down to earth, caring, good people. Humility, the Zera Shimshon says, is the most important character trait. If there's one trait that a person absolutely needs to succeed in life, to succeed in their connection with God and with their surroundings, with everyone around them, is humility. Because through humility, everything else good can come. You can draw out any other proper good character trait out of the source, the root of humility. So may God bless us that we should all always be close in our connection to God. Back to the first thing we spoke about meat and wine. Understand that any type of indulging, including meat and wine, is all there as a way to connect to God, to grow with God. And we should also remember that our greatest connection with God will always be through our humility and understanding the vast difference, the greatness between us and God, and even around others. Because as soon as we realize that we are lacking and we have what to grow and what to learn, then we will be greater. Remember that greatness is synonymous with humility. With this, I am going to open the mics for everyone to ask a question. I do have a question texted in over here. question is, did Moshe divorce Tzipporah or just separated from her? So I believe he wrote her a get. They received the Torah, and in the Torah there are the laws of not only a ketubah, which is a marriage document, but there's also a divorce document. So he did properly divorce from his wife Tzipporah. I'm going to allow everyone to unmute themselves. One moment. Okay, anyone who would like to unmute themselves, you may be able to now. If you have
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hi, Arlene. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any questions?
You know that I always have a question, Rabbi.
Where are you? I'm looking for you. There you are, Isaac. Okay, there you are. Go for it.
I'm sorry, I have two questions today.
Okay.
Okay. The first question, you know that fowl is not considered meat. It was considered meat later on because of what happened, the milk and the... So now God is giving them meat. It's considered meat what he's giving them, but it's not really meat. Basar may be something else. Why are we saying that this is considered meat?
You are referring to the quail that God gave the Jewish people in the when they requested meat?
Yes. It's meat? Is it quail? What is it?
So yes, just to reiterate, meat is all kosher animals, whether they are fowl, bird, right, or whether they are really animals. The only difference really is between meat, that type of meat, and fish. But chicken, turkey, duck, that's all, quail is all really considered meat.
Always, or just recently was a rabbinical?
No. The rabbinical decree was not, so that was always. The answer is always. Poultry was always considered meat. The eating of meat and milk is a rabbinical prohibition because the Torah says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, that we're not allowed to cook meat of an animal, right, in its mother's milk. And that the Torah prohibits all meat and milk, whether it's real mother or not, or whether it's the same species or not, amongst animals. The rabbis came and they said, since poultry is so similar to meat, although we know there's definite differences, but since it's so similar to meat, it is also prohibited to have it with milk. Okay?
And how many children did Moshe have with his wife?
Moshe had 2 sons.
That's it.
Yeah. And we don't hear too much about them. And that's a whole thing to talk about. We're not going to talk about it now.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good. Anyone else? Any questions?
Yes.
Please.
Yes, go.
Hi. You said that earlier about the man that Hashem, the man was directly given to us from Hashem. Just like Hashem gave us the man, he also gave us the animals because the animals were created by God. So it's the same thing. It's a question that we wanted something different. So somehow your answer didn't sit right with me because we're all meat lovers. Majority of people are meat lovers. And since God did create the animals, it's still from Hashem. We may not have asked the question in the proper way, but it was a question that we're allowed to ask. I see nothing wrong with it. That's just my opinion.
Okay, right. I understand, but the way that the Zera Shimshon's presenting it to us, the way that all the commentaries presented to us, is that they were asking it in a way that they wanted to indulge, to connect with the physicality and the animalistic aspects of it. It wasn't like they were trying to connect out of a spiritual reason or for any spiritual reason at all. Meaning, yes, animals are given to us by God, obviously, but it's way more apparent to us when this Wonder Bread comes down from Shamayim and from the heavens, and it's there on a daily basis, exactly the way and the portion that we needed. It was more apparent that it was directly from God, to answer your question.
So I think something else we might want to say is that our approach, and when we want to ask a question, know exactly, think before you speak. So it's just another approach.
Right.
But I want to thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions?
Yehuda.
Yes. Hi, Yehuda.
Hey, I'm not trying to imitate Isaac, but I want to ask a little question. Hi, Isaac. How are you, Eva? Basically, there was always a discussion, not like in a Shiva forum, but among friends. You said not tevashel gdi b'chalev imo. That means if it is not gdi, is it okay levashel b'chalev imo? Some people look at that little sentence saying that God is merciful. He should not kill a gdi while he is still, nursing milk. So I wonder if you ever heard about it.
So the Talmud says, it's not exactly that, similar to that. The Talmud says that it's heartless. So let me give you another law that's in the Torah. You're not allowed to slaughter a baby and its parent animal in the same day, right? Regardless of cooking them in its milk or not, that's a law, and that is because it's heartless to do that. It's also heartless to cook a baby in its mother's milk. Now, even though the Torah presents the prohibition of meat and milk in that form, it's not limited to that form. But okay, so the idea of killing it while it's nursing, no, that's not something which is found in the Talmud.
We see a beautiful example when we see one of the commandments that tells us that we need to shoo away the mother bird from her nest before taking her eggs. And then maybe if you want to explain why, and that could answer the other question.
Okay, so the Torah does tell us that before we go and we take the eggs of a mother bird in her nest, we need to shoo her away before we take it, and that also is something out of compassion and of mercy that we do. So that is, again, it is a reason. It's the way the Torah presents not eating meat and milk, but it's clear that it's not limited to that form. Okay.
I have another question.
Sure.
About when we know that Miriam got punished because she spoke Lashon Hara, but wasn't she talking to Aaron? And we learned that if the person who's the bystander, the person that's listening, also gets punished. So did he get punished because of it?
Good question. So the prohibition, and again, I want to take this opportunity to thank my mom and her amazing women's group that studies, I think it's on a daily basis, right? On a daily basis, the laws of Lashon Hara from the Chafetz Chaim, and some of the participants are on with us this evening. Very, very important question. So, yes, we know that it is 3 people who are affected from the speaking of Lashon Hara, of speaking derogatory or slander about another individual. It's obviously the speaker, it's the listener, and it's also the subject, the person they're talking about. Now, having said that, the Torah also tells us that the punishment for speaking Lashon Hara is leprosy. That punishment is specific to the speaker. Only the speaker receives leprosy. The listener has their fault, their transgression as well. The subject has their transgression as well, right? The Chafetz Chaim explains because he or she is allowing himself or herself to be portrayed in a way for other people to speak negative about them. But those 2 people, the subject and the listener, are not punished with leprosy. Only the speaker is. And that's why Miriam was the only one who received leprosy. Okay?
Okay, that's a good question.
Any other questions?
It could also, I'm not sure who was the one who asked the question, but one answer that I can offer, and I've seen it in Mamloez, is that you see Aaron, you're saying that how come he didn't get, well, leprosy, like my son said, leprosy, the person who actually says the Lashon Hara is the one who gets the leprosy. The one who listened to it is going to get affected. Unfortunately, you saw what happened with Aaron, right? Aaron Cohen, he ended up losing 2 of his 4 sons. Now, the reason why the 2 sons passed away, and there's a few reasons, there could be a few reasons from the Mefarshim that explain that, but that's on them themselves. But what about Aaron?
Why did he have to endure that punishment?
In fact, could it have been because of the golden calf? Could it have been because he heard his sister say Lashon Hara? Who knows what the answer could be? Remember, it could always be the last straw that broke the camel's back. So that hopefully maybe that can satisfy. I mean, that's a huge one. I mean, I'd rather be in the position of Miriam and just get leprosy than to have heard Lashon Hara and Haz v'Shalom, look what happened to, look what happened to 2 of his sons. So just maybe.
We don't know all the cheshbon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We just know, and that's why we learn that we should all be very careful on what we say and what we hear and even what we see. So that's why we say that little blessing every day. The women say that. We always ask Hashem to help us to be successful in not complaining, not embarrassing, not speaking Lashon Hara about anybody, no talk of arrogance, all of those things. So we can only try, and the more we learn, and our sages tell us that we're almost always going to fail. We're going to come short. We're going to make a mistake. But if we continue to learn, then we can just protect ourselves by learning the lessons. And this is also a bit of an answer to what Yehuda asked about other animals. Just like when we speak about inanimate objects, we shouldn't use Lashon Hara. Yes, they're not going to get offended, but we shouldn't use harsh language at all. And that's for us, because it makes us bigger, better, and Am Kadosh. And that's our aim. So this class was outstanding, Rabbi. Thank you so much. How deep. I've never studied this Parsha in such a beautiful way. Kol hakavod. Chazak
And
u'baruch.
great questions from the audience.
Amazing students here. Amazing.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Okay, stay tuned for tomorrow night. It's going to change your Shabbat table. I'm sure, I don't know about you. We'll speak about it tomorrow, but my Shabbat table this past week, we've had some great Shabbats. Many of you have spent it with us also, but last week was very special in my mind. Like, the kids had no idea what was going on. My wife heard the class, so she knew that I was, so to say, prompting it. But in my mind, so many things were racing to how to do, what to do, and I was like replaying everything that Chaim was, and myself, what we were trying to present. And as amazing as last week's Shabbat was, stay tuned for tomorrow night. This Shabbat is going to top that one, Bizrat Hashem. So great to see everybody. Thank you for everybody joining, and we'll see you tomorrow night, Bizrat Hashem.